Well, it's a real pleasure to speak to you today in Buenos Aires. I've been here a number of times, and I've made it a point of knowing a lot about history. History is really important when it comes to understanding what's happening. Let me just say that I've lived in Latin America. I was a missionary for the Mormon Church back in the 1960s. And so it's been a while since I've spoken Spanish, so but I've maintained a very strong interest in Latin America. And there's some major differences between the two countries. Before I get into that, I thought since it's Sunday, I should start off with my sermon on wealth. And so, let's see if this works here. Maybe it's this one I turn. Okay, there it is. So, John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church, gave the first pro-wealth sermon in history. If you know anything about the history of Christianity in the Bible, there are many statements that are anti-wealth, particularly by one by Jesus, where he told the young person, the young wealthy merchant, to sell all he has, give it to the poor, and follow me. The young man was very wealthy, so he did not agree with that and went his own way. And we don't know what happened to him. And then Paul gets up and says, the love of money is the root of all evil. And of course, Mark Twain corrected St. Paul by saying the lack of money is the root of all evil. At any rate, there was this long-standing tradition that was really anti-wealth, anti-capitalist mentality that went through St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas to some extent, but even Luther and other Protestants had this attitude that money was money-making, particularly speculation, was somehow sinful and very selfish as a vice. So Wesley is really important because as the founder of the Methodist Church, he gave this sermon, number 50, in 1741, and he said there are three grand principles that all good Methodists should live by. Gain all you can, save all you can, and a little self-serving, he said, give all you can. Notice he never said spend all you can, which is a more Keynesian modern view of society. And what's interesting is the Methodists became on a per capita basis in the 19th century, not only the most popular Protestant church, but also the wealthiest in per capita terms, because they were known to be rather parsimonious in terms of spending, but they were constantly saving and investing and creating businesses. And so there's a lot to be said for this perspective here, that it was okay to gain all you can. So anyway, that's my Sunday sermon for you. So I want to show you a chart here about the difference between North America and Latin America. Have any of you seen this chart before? So this is the Economic Freedom Index that was done by the Fraser Institute and the Heritage Foundation. They both do the Economic Freedom Index. You can see a big distinction, can't you, between Latin America and the Caribbean versus North America. And I've always been interested in why that is, why there's this huge gap, not only in terms of wealth and distribution of wealth, in the inequality issue, but also in terms of just economic freedom. I think one of the other speakers mentioned there's this definite correlation between economic freedom and wealth and standard of living. But just in terms of this chart here, you notice that Canada and the United States fits in the green category, meaning they have they are pretty free market oriented overall. And then all the Latin American countries you can see are pretty much blue and purple, and even Venezuela, purple. I mentioned before that Venezuela used to be green. They were green until they started nationalizing their industries, particularly their oil industry. So this chart really kind of says it all. I actually give a lecture sometime. Maybe I'll give it next year on, it's called Amazing Graphs. It's kind of a play on Amazing Grace. And it's like 24 charts that just blow your mind. And this is one that I would definitely want to add. So my question that I'd like to identify today is, to what extent is there a cultural, economic, and political difference between Latin America and North America? Okay, let's see here if I can get it to the next one. Okay, so as you can see here, North America was largely settled by a diverse group of English and European colonists, primarily English, who were religious and political dissidents. And they believed in individual rights and rejected the authority of the king. They also had at a very early time, practical experience in electing assemblies and democracy. So they were voting at a very early age. So you had the development of democratic republics. And then you had economic freedom under rule of law, limited government, and robust competition. The Adam Smith model is basically under the rule of law and robust competition, you want to maximize freedom. Maximize freedom. Thank you. And then you had competing cultures and religions. There was no one single religion. Even though there was discrimination and laws against people at certain points and so on, because of competition, the freedom of religion came very early in North American colonies. Now contrast that with Latin America, who was settled by conquistadores from Spain and Portugal under centralized power and monopoly control. Their main focus was the exploitation of natural resources, gold, silver, cash crops, tobacco, sugar, coffee, and cotton. And then they adopted a top-down authoritarian rule appointing governors. So there was no democracy, there was no voting at all. It was all by appointment of governors, the Gran Caudillo, officers and clergy. There was no parliament or elected assembly in the beginning centuries of Latin America. So you had large land grants. So land reform became a very important aspect of Latin America when they got their independence, and lots of monopolies. And then you had the cultural hierarchy, which is very European, with the viceroys and military leaders on the top, followed by the landowners, the merchants, and the clergy. And then under that group, the workers, shopkeepers, tradesmen, farmers, and finally the slaves, enslaved workers. And you had a single religion throughout Latin America, and even today, Catholic Church is by far the largest denomination and dominates those areas. So that's a major distinction, and a lot of people say, well, why do you have this authoritarian regimes? And it's basically because of this history. So if you don't know history, you don't understand Latin America. You absolutely must be grounded in this basic history. Okay, so I think I went past. So wait a minute, I want to see here. Okay, so you have this series of Latin American regimes and strongman dictators, and we could spend a day on each one of them. But since we're in Buenos Aires, since we're in Argentina, let me talk a little bit about Perón. because Juan Perón really changed Argentina. And many of you know this, but Argentina in 1853 adopted a US-style constitution. You had separation of powers, you had checks and balances, you had a bicameral Congress, you had 6-year presidency, and you have a Bill of Rights. There was a high level of immigration in Argentina, 50%, and you had a liberal oligopoly until 1914. It was urban, European, commercial, industrialized, and the 6th richest country in the world by 1914. And there was more per capita gold than Great Britain or the United States. However, with the advent of Colonel Juan Perón, who became popular among the officers, he was tall, good at boxing and fencing. He wrote a book on military history. And in 1939, Italy, he was mesmerized by Italy and by Mussolini's power in his fascism and Hitler's Nazi party. And noticed that under Hitler, there was no depression. And he noted that, and he said, wow, that makes a case for a strong man. And so in June of 1943, there was a coup that made Juan Perón vice president and minister of war and secretary of labor. He was very pro-labor. He argued for the 8-hour day, the minimum wage, unions, purging of communists, and no strikes. So he's quite popular along with his wife, Evita, as his mistress and his wife. She was also very impressed. He was arrested at one point and then freed. And then October 17th, 1943, at a mass rally. So anyway, he was dictator from 1946 to 55. Now here's some interesting things that a lot of you may not know about what kind of power he had. First of all, he created a single party. There was no competition, the Peronista party. Opposition was arrested. The Supreme Court was impeached. It was a crime to criticize Perón or his wife Evita in public. Or you couldn't also not criticize the military. You could be, he could be reelected indefinitely, not just 6 years. The opposition press was destroyed. All radio, TV stations became state-owned. The Gestapo, the special police, was created. All workers and professional groups were syndicated as businesses, like unions. English was banned. You were not allowed to speak English. Just you go through some of these things, you get blown away. The creation of new state enterprises, airlines, oil and gas, and the banks. There was no new investment during this time period. Inflation, the peso went from $4 to $18 over a 10-year period. Evita's Social Aid Foundation created secret bank accounts worth $700 million. So the corruption was unbelievable. Perón was excommunicated by the Catholics. Churches were burned by the special police. And of course, he finally resigned and went to Spain in 1955 and returned in 1973, but died a year later. And the Peronistas maintained power in the 90s and 2000s and are still a tremendous force to be reckoned with. So it's quite a story, isn't it, about the impact of a single person. You know, the Austrians talk about the Wieser, the Austrian economist, talked about the great man theory. And the idea is that a single person can make a huge difference. And you can see this, fortunately, with President Milei in that respect, because overall I think he's he's doing a good job in reducing the size of government and so forth. I do criticize him I've had a number of Argentines tell me that they're not happy with his behavior as a president and his language. So that's an interesting criticism of Milei. You know, it's kind of the benevolent dictator syndrome that you can get. Incredible power can be used both for good and for evil. Now, what about the influence of the liberation theology? I have a book called The Making of Modern Economics, which President Milei has read. He told me that last night, so I have a picture about that. But the Marxist influence in culture is really quite important here. And in all of Latin America, liberation theology has played a major role. And Pope Francis, who recently passed away, was very instrumental in promoting this liberation theology idea. I mean, if you look at this quote here, we can no longer trust in the unseen forces and the invisible hand of the market. Today, everything comes under the laws of competition and survival of the fittest, where the powerful feed upon the powerless. As a consequence, masses of people find themselves excluded and marginalized, without work, without possibilities, without any means of escape. What does he blame that on? Capitalism. Not socialism, but capitalism. And it's so misguided in its approach. While the earnings of a minority are growing exponentially, so too is the gap separating the majority from prosperity enjoyed by those happy few. This imbalance is a result of ideologies which defend the absolute autonomy of the marketplace and financial speculation. And he actually said at one point, if you don't give to the poor, you are robbing the poor. And so he made no distinction between voluntary charity and forced charity. We will see if the new Pope from the United States makes a difference in that respect. But I was really quite surprised at that you can see how liberation theology had reached the point of indoctrinating the Catholic Church. Very different from John Paul II, right? Quite a distinction there and so forth. Okay. The Adam Smith model is the basis of the Economic Freedom Index that I just showed you. And there are 5 elements of that Adam Smith model. One is it's pro-savings, like the Methodist preacher, John Wesley. Limited government, low taxes, sound money, something like the gold standard, something that gives you stable money, honest money. Tolerable administration of justice. I like what Adam Smith says there. There's no way you can have a perfect model of justice. But if you can have a tolerable administration of justice, then it can be very successful. And then finally, free trade. Now, out of all 5 of these categories, there was a study done by Jim Gortney at Florida State University. And he said out of the 5, he did an econometric model, and he found out which one of the 5 had the most impact in terms of economic growth, rising standard of living, and equality. So which of the 5 do you think it is? How many think the most important thing was being pro-saving? Anybody? Okay, how about limited government, low taxes? All right. Sound money. How about tolerable administration of justice? And finally, free trade. Okay, so everybody voted one way or another. Gortney found that number 4, the tolerable administration of justice, was the most important thing. And for those of you from Brazil, you know that's exactly the case. And even in the United States, I was talking to a friend of mine, actually, at Chapman University, who had a very nice home in Irving, California. And when he moved on, he kept the home and he rented it. And the renters became squatters. And here it is several years later, and he can't get rid of them because the courts simply won't enforce the property rights in California. So it's been a major problem, and it's not just in California. We had the same problem, my wife and I, in Virginia. So the Squatters' rights and renters' rights versus landlords is a serious problem in the U.S. And it's probably much worse in many other countries. Okay. So the Economic Freedom Index has these measures, these 5 ways of measuring it. This started in the 1980s. Milton and Rose Friedman were approached by Michael Walker at the Fraser Institute, and they put together them along with Ed Follner and others at Heritage, and they came up with the Economic Freedom Index, a way to measure quantitatively economic freedom. And it's been a very powerful tool, as you can see, in measuring how well countries are doing. So here's the Adam Smith model demonstrating that clearly the more economic freedom, the more you have a higher standard of living. But there's a warning, and that is the danger of economic freedom. Since the pandemic, 2020, we've seen a decline in world economic freedom. But maybe it's just a blip. Maybe we'll have a rising standard after that. U.S. economic index has actually been in decline since 9/11, 2001. Patriot Act, war in Iraq, the financial crisis, all created more government regulation in the United States. Latin American economic freedom, you can see, was a big jump with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the central planning model of the Soviet Union. That's when Latin American countries in particular said, hey, we're going to now invite foreign investment in our country. You're no longer imperialists. And we're going to reduce import substitution laws, which were extremely bad for the local economies there, and still are the case. It's very unfortunate that Trump has adopted import substitution laws that Latin Americans, if they just go down and spend time in Latin America and see how cars were built. I remember in 1968, we had a Buick, our church had a Buick made in Venezuela. And you could get an American-made Buick, but there was a 300% duty on it. So that was forcing Venezuelans to buy Venezuela-made Buicks. Well, it was in the shop every other week. It was totally undependable. This is one of the problems with import substitution laws. So you can see Latin America made great strides, and then it's kind of stabilized and then started to decline, as you can see there. So this is a chart by Jose Piñera from Chile. He's the labor secretary under Pinochet. And he demonstrated rather clearly the Chilean model that the Chicago boys adopted in Chile was an adoption of the Adam Smith model. And look at the economic growth rate compared to the other Latin American countries. And then look at Venezuela that chose to go the opposite direction. Your country, Jose, I mean, it's the greatest tragedy in Latin. It's worse than Cuba because Venezuela was the richest country in Latin America when I was there as a missionary. And it had the highest economic growth rate among Latin American countries. And now it's just the opposite. And there's a lot of reasons why that, but Chavez in particular was a charismatic leader like Perón, okay? Number 2, from the military. He understood the military. You have to control the military, which the Chilean communists did not recognize. That was their mistake, quote. And finally, it's the curse of the natural resource country. One source, as Jose was saying yesterday, oil business, and they gradually nationalized that industry, slowly but surely. 50% of profits, then 50% of ownership, then 100% of ownership, and gradually took over and destroyed that industry. So I'm a financial economist. You all have a copy of my newsletter. I'm recommending the Argentine Fund. We've made a lot of money, as you can see. You can see Latin America does have a gradual. They've kindly thrown off most of the regulations and so on. You have a gradual increase. It's an international company, but Argentina has broken out as an outlier there because of the policies of Milei. So I was very pleased for the first time to meet Milei. These are pictures that I had yesterday. That was just a wonderful event last night. It was just one of the most important events in my life because I wanted to meet this transformation. You know, they say that Donald Trump is transformational in the United States. I guess he is in terms of this Fortress America concept. But Malaya is much more open market in that respect. And I brought a copy of my Spanish edition of the Making of Modern Economics, which has been probably my most popular book that I've ever written in economics because it makes Adam Smith the hero, and you have enemies like the Marxists and the socialists, and then he has defenders, and I have a good ending with the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet central planning system. So it was translated into a number of languages, including Unión Editorial translated my book into Spanish, and I presented a copy to him thinking he had never seen it before. And he immediately, his eyes lit up and he said, "Oh my gosh, you're Mark Skousen. I've read your book and I love it," he said. I love that enthusiasm. So anyway, I think Unión Editorial is going to need to do a updated edition for me. That would be really cool. So anyway, it's just a real pleasure to see him. And we've invited, hopefully we can get him to come to Freedom Fest. He had to cancel the first time, unfortunately, so hopefully he can do that again. There we go. So that's our next year's Freedom Fest, which is several thousand people gathering from around the world. And we love, we've worked a lot with Liberty International. Many of you have been to our Freedom Fest conference, and we hope you will join us. And with that, I thank you all and hope you learned something today. Thank you very much. So we have time for questions. Okay. Short questions, please, so we can cover as many people as possible. Jose?
Today is a very important day in Argentina. Today is the anniversary of the death of San Martin. There was a big fiasco yesterday because the Argentinian ambassador in Spain said, "Viva el Rey!" He said that in Spain. But among strong men, you had Simón Bolívar and Venezuelan, as you know. You did not have José San Martín. They fought actually because Bolívar wanted a republic. San Martín wanted a monarchy. And you didn't have a San Martín in there.
No, I didn't. That's true.
And today is an important day, and he was a monarchical person. Bolívar was a republican.
And Bolívar actually taught that the citizens of Venezuela were as children and need to be taught as children. So that authoritarian dictatorship concept developed right away in Latin America because of Simón Bolívar. But you're saying San Martín was more democratic?
No, the opposite.
They were all, okay.
Advocated for a monarchy. Bolívar advocated for a republic.
Yeah, okay. Next, Alberto.
Professor Skousen, I enjoyed very much your excellent lecture, as always. I want to go back for a minute to Pope Francis. Mm-hmm. He was interviewed in 2016 in Rome, and he was asked, "What do you say when people stress that you're a communist?" The answer was, "Communist takes their principles from Christianism."
Oh boy.
And I think, wow. I have written about this, I think as Cardinal von Balthasar said, the Vatican as a political institution should not exist because the Bible says, "My kingdom is not from this world."
Wow.
Mussolini consolidated the Vatican in 1929. Now, in my last point is about John Paul II. I always remember in a Mont Pelerin Society in Cancun in Mexico, Michael Novak coming to me with a champagne, and he said, "Alberto, I suggest we have a toast for chapter 42. Chapter 42 from Centesimus Annus explains the reason and supports capitalism." As you know, Professor Skousen, Hayek and Michael Novak influenced very much John Paul II in this point. Just this.
And I would add, Michael Novak's book, Does It Liberate, or Is It Liberating? Something like that. It was his title of his, a whole book criticizing liberation theology. And it's an extremely important book, and he deserves a lot of credit for that. Right behind you, there's, yeah.
There's one question over there.
Oh, okay, yes.
I'm from Colombia, and I feel one of our main issues is also the war on drugs and the context that we have with cocaine and illegal crops. I wanted to know your thoughts on these issues, especially in countries like Colombia, Mexico, Venezuela, and the pursuit of freedom and prosperity.
Well, I have always been a libertarian, or more libertarian on this issue. There are libertarians on both sides of this issue, believe it or not. But Milton Friedman said it best: the government doesn't tell me what I should say out of my mouth. Why should I allow them to tell me what I put in my mouth, and or shoot up or whatever? So we as libertarians believe in maximum freedom, but with freedom comes responsibility. So even though we would legalize drugs, we would also emphasize it's extremely important to educate people about the dangers of drugs. And that, unfortunately, is not, we haven't done a very good job of that, I think. When we, in the United States, when we ended prohibition of alcohol, immediately you had AA develop Alcohol Anonymous, and it was by a Christian organization that established that. Very powerful education, and the number of people drinking alcohol in the United States has been on decline, and now it's down to 50%. I know it's really big here in Latin America and so forth, but non-alcoholic drinks are really growing in influence, and maybe we can, if drugs are legalized, and it doesn't look like we're moving, I think we're moving in the direction of marijuana legalization, but the hard drugs is a much tougher one to sell, because there's evidence on both sides on that issue and how difficult it is.
Mark, I'm wondering, so when it comes to the Free the World chart, I think from a macro standpoint, it tends to be, so. But I also think when I look at it, for one, Canada being above the United States has always kind of confused everybody I've ever talked to. They're all just like, why is Canada freer? And I'm like, I don't know, read the 500-page report and figure it out, because I don't know. And the other things that I sort of think is, when I go to Mexico, I am freer, because the Mexican government is not in my business at all. They don't care what you do, so long as you don't open up a
buy
little
some
store.
land on the coast and see if the
You will have a
government
whole different
doesn't get
experience.
involved.
Indeed.
Okay.
All I'm saying is that
Try to create an oil rig.
the chart addresses scope. It doesn't address reach and will in the way that governments do. And I'm wondering if you know, can think of a way that it could be improved in some manner.
Yeah, that's always a problem with the Economic Freedom Index, is you're trying to quantify things that maybe sometimes aren't as quantifiable. It's more of an art than a science. So I understand that problem. And actually Canada, I remember a time when you could just drive across Canada and there's no border at all. So there are some indications of reduced freedom. So maybe it's all relative. Well, it's relatively free compared to other countries. And they do have a category of maximum freedom in Singapore, economically, by the way. This is economics, not politics. As in Singapore, there's very little voting as far as the elections and stuff like that. It's more appointing a dictatorship and stuff like that. Benevolent dictator. Lee Kuan Yew is the classic example, and everybody tries to imitate him in that respect. Yeah. I hope they can improve. Heritage has 10 different categories, but a lot of it's political too, because governments are looking to see how they're ranked. And Singapore loves the fact that they're number one now. By the way, the United States is ranked number 60 in the world in terms of trade barriers. And one of the things you have to make an important distinction between is tariffs and trade barriers, non-tariff barriers like licensing and business approvals and stuff like that. When Donald Trump said we're being ripped off, he was actually referring to the fact that U.S. has a hard time exporting a lot of its goods. We're pretty open in terms of bringing goods in the United States, but he was complaining about that. So all of my MAGA free market friends, and there's a bunch of them, saying that the only thing Trump is trying to do is be on a more fair trade kind of argument on both sides. And I think he's clearly moving away from that. As somebody said, I think he's definitely a protectionist. Is that it? Thank you very much.